unit, what's expected, what you need to do. We've already touched on the importance of accessing the textbook. I just mentioned the fact that in all past trimesters, and we've been running this unit for a long time, there's a very strong relationship between not doing well in the exam and not having the textbook. And as I was intimating before, the lectures and lecture slides do not cover all the material. They're not a comprehensive coverage. There's no way you can do that in 3 hours. They are to help you provide focus, and you really need to do the chapter reading and the other readings, as I have suggested, in order to really grasp this unit properly and be able to perform well in the exam. You might find in the group assignment that your group does okay. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security and thinking that's okay, as some people did. They said, oh, our group did really well in the assignment. And I said, well, what did you do? Oh, I put the pieces together and I did the table of contents and checked the spelling and things like that. And I was really surprised when I did so badly in the exam. Clearly, those individuals hadn't really tested out their capacity in the group environment to really contribute. So you do need to look at the textbook, so I do encourage you. Yes? Yes, yeah, there's an e-version. Yes, that's correct. And so you'll find that mentioned in the welcome message. You'll find it in the details in the unit guide. And you'll also find the details when you go to the bookshop if you want to simply purchase a copy under the unit code. By all means, buy the e-version. If you're going to buy a version, that's fine. And I also encourage you to consider using the library versions. The library has a limited number of e-versions available. And the problem is that the library has not subscribed to 120 copies, of which that's how many people are, actually 130 odd. Assuming at least some of them have the textbook, the library doesn't have the number of e-versions. So when it comes to exam time, close to the assignment time, you'll find that the library's subscription is maxed out and you won't be able to get onto that. So that's a bit of a drawback there. But certainly the e-version is a good and reasonably economical option. Second-hand book is obviously the other option as well. If you want to use an older version, that's not a big problem. Obviously, they've changed it around a bit. That's the whole purpose of different editions, but not so dramatically that you can't use it. And if you do have a previous edition, for example, let me know, and I can give you a little bit of help with conversion between the two, so you know what's going on. But it's fairly self-evident. They haven't made really dramatic changes, but they have done some adjustments and split chapters up, and so forth and so on. So, short end of the message, make sure you use the textbook. That will help you be ready for the exam. And as I indicated, you can certainly use the slides and the revision slide in the last week as a focus, but don't assume that that is all the content you require. It's just a visual aid. All right, you can see that I have the unit guide up there, so I just thought we'd roll through that now. It's a bit of a boring start, but anyway, the problem with these sorts of mornings is that, as you can see, people just keep rolling in, so we're not really in a position to do anything too exciting to kick off. So let's do this, and then if anyone comes late, it's not the end of the world for them if they miss out on a few bits and pieces. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so you've got my welcome message. This is the textbook that I recommended. It's just come out at the end of last year. We adopted it trimester 2 last year. It's the 11th edition. As I indicated, if you've got the 10th edition, not a problem. 9th edition, okay, not too bad either. So you can get second-hand copies. The e-version of the 11th edition is probably the best value for money in terms of ease of use and cost. And as I indicated, whilst the library has a number of e-versions, when everyone wants to use them around exam time and as the lead up to the assignment, you'll find that you won't be able to get a go at it through the library. Oops. Now it's decided to move properly. Okay, assessment. We've only got 2 pieces of assessment in this unit, so it's not too hard. A group assignment and also an exam, 2-hour exam. So the group assignment is due in on May 29, I think, but we'll check anyway. Sorry? 30th April, that's right, yes, 30th April. Sorry, I'm running 2 units at the same time, so it's hard to remember the dates. So we've got the group assignment, which is due in then, and we've also got the exam, which will be during the exam period. The recordings of these lectures will, of course, be available through the cloud classrooms. So I encourage you to have another listen to those if there's anything you've missed. And we've got a few people studying online, so there'll be a few conversations going on there as well. So you've got my contact details there if you need to. I have indicated a consultation time starting at 10 o'clock on Tuesday mornings. So if you've got questions, you want to come along without an appointment, then Tuesday at 10 is the time to turn up. Okay, well, I won't drag you through the learning outcomes. You can have a look at those yourself. There's a hurdle requirement. You have to pass the exam. That's a reflection of the fact that the assignment's a group assignment, and it's possible for your group to do okay in the assignment, but perhaps not because of your contributions so much. So we have a hurdle requirement of passing the exam. So even if you get a really good group assignment, don't assume that you can bomb out in the exam and still get through. You need to pass the exam, irrespective of how well you do in the group assignment. Okay, so the first assessment task is worth 40%. It's due on the 30th of April. It's a group assignment. We'll have a brief look at that at the end of today's session. 3,500 words. How many words should you write? Between 3,000 and 3,500 is what you should target. Some people ask me, is it the word limit plus or minus 10%? It's not a prescription, it's a limit. I don't get too fussed if you're a few words over, but you shouldn't really be writing over 3,500 words. It's not required for this assignment. It means that your writing style is a bit loose and disorganised if you need to use more than 3,500 words. So sometimes people try to get clever and they say, oh, but it doesn't include tables, and they put giant tables in and so forth. It doesn't actually make it better. It's not about volume, it's about clarity and being focused and putting your argument succinctly rather than great long descriptions and long wordy stuff. So it's a bit of a challenge with the group because everyone writes their own bit and they all write too much, and you put it together and you've got 5,000 words. And then you shuffle it around a bit and you're down a bit, then you put some in appendices and you get a bit smaller. But at the end of the day, you need a really strong cogent argument, single line argument, not a combination of arguments to get a good mark. So if you're hitting around 3,500 words, I would say look carefully at how clear you've been, because you've probably got far too many words in certain sections, and the more words you have, the quicker you lose the message, the quicker it starts to get diluted, or slightly different perspectives on what you're trying to say start to creep in, and it starts to lose its focus. So a nice, lean, tight article. If it's under 3,000 words and it makes the point, I'm really happy with that. You're not going to lose marks for under 3,000 words if you've really done a good job. If you do an okay job and it's reasonably clean and tight, you should be low 3,000s, 3,200 should be enough for that. If you're hitting 3,500 words, then you're at the point where it's starting to get a bit wordy and it's a bit fluffy and disorganised in certain areas. And if you're at 3,000, much over 3,500 words, apart from the fact you've exceeded the word limit, you probably haven't done a good job of the assignment and you really need to do some fine-tuning. So that's the word limit. It's worth a significant proportion of your overall marks, 40%. So it's a good opportunity to establish a good foundation for a good mark in the unit. But as I indicated, even if you got 38% for this, or 38 marks for this towards your 100 marks, you can't rock into the exam and get 12 marks and expect to pass the unit. You still have to get 50% for the exam. Okay, so that's it. You submit online. You need to register a group, and then one person submits the assignment on behalf of the whole group. Yes?
How many members?
I've specified 3 to 5, I think, from memory. 3, sorry? 2 to 3, sorry. Where is it there? We'll look at this. I've got the details in the assignment thing, which we'll look at later. So it's 2 to 3. All right, the exam, pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. 2-hour exam. During the exam period, it covers everything. People say, what will the exam focus on? It focuses on everything. So you need to cover all of the topics in preparation for the exam. What else do we need? Contact hours, we've already talked about. Assignments grouped 2 to 3 people. Johnson & Scholes or Whittington, you need that. The dates. Now what I might do is I might move over to the timetable now. Okay, welcome to those people who are arriving a bit late. You'll need to listen to the recording to get what we to pick up on what we've already talked about. We will start pretty much on the dot of 9 o'clock in the morning. So if you can get here by then, that would be a good thing. All right. So timetable. We have a session for each week. The 11th session, as you can see down the bottom there, this one here, is revision session. So we've got 10 content sessions, including today, and 1 revision session. We've got a title for each of those, and they pretty much follow the format of the book. And then we've got, as you can see in that right-hand column, allocated, on the right-hand side, the allocated chapters. So we're pretty much following the order of the book, skipping a couple of chapters, which aren't relevant, chapters 10 and 11, and then 16 through 18 we don't deal with because they're more advanced and they're not in the scope. So, and in some weeks, like next week, we deal with 2 chapters. So what you need to do, you need to read the chapters before the lecture rather than after the lecture. You can reread it by all means, but you should have had a reasonable look through the chapter so that you can come along and ask questions and so that it provides clarity rather than your first exposure to that. So the trick is to have read the chapters in advance. What we will also be doing from here on the following weeks is we'll be spending some of our time discussing the case at the end of the chapter. So all the chapters have quite a nice little up-to-date case around strategy and practice that relates to that particular topic. So we won't do it this week, but in the following weeks we'll invest a bit of time in discussing that. And I will be asking for opinions about the cases, so you will need to have familiarised yourself with the case. They're only 1.5 pages, they're not big. But you will have to have some opinions, and I will be calling for answers to questions about that, and we'll assemble a bit of a case analysis in a live way rather than just having the slides, because for 3 hours the slides gets a bit on the boring side. So that's that. As I said, we're running pretty much progressively through the book. So just to give you a quick idea, so today is all about introducing the idea of strategy and what it really means. Strategy is a very much overused term. It gets confused with planning and a whole lot of other things, but there's a fair bit more to it, as you will discover. And we've got a couple of categories of strategy thinking. We've got strategic position, which we deal with for 4 weeks. And that includes understanding the external environment of the organisation, the forces that it's dealing with, including competitors, but industry factors and so forth. It also includes understanding who the organisation is responsible for and what's the purpose of the organisation. The stakeholders, one of the key stakeholders could be investors, for example, shareholders, in which case one of the organisation's purposes is to generate an income for those people. But the stakeholders could equally be the government, or it could be a not-for-profit, so they could be members, association members, in which case there'll be a purpose for the organisation to meet their needs as well. So that's another critical component of the organisation's position. A third component which we deal with in week 3 are strategic capabilities, and this is a core concept of strategy which has been coming since the 1950s but really became consolidated in the early 1990s as the idea that one of the best explanations for how businesses succeed is the strategic capabilities that they have and the strategic resources that they provide. Now, strategic resources are not finance, strategic resources are not buildings. They may be people, staff, but they may not be staff as well. They are the things that actually create the competitive advantage. So we'll look at that in more detail. That's a really important concept to grasp, and it's one that's highly distorted in other domains. The word resources is obviously used extensively for many different things, and so it's quite easy to lose track of what it means in terms of strategy, but it's actually a very tightly defined concept. And a very important one, which has driven strategy thinking now for the last 20 years, or 25 years in fact. Then basically we finished with that. Then we finished that strategic position with a consideration of the organisation's culture in relation to its strategy, and that's a critical relationship as well in terms of implementing strategy. Then we get into 2 weeks of considering strategic choices. This is business strategy and analysis, so we'll be considering the business level strategy. We have 3 levels of strategy. Functional strategy, which, actually I'll start at the top. Corporate strategy, which thinks about the structure of the organisation, issues such as where the organisation operates. Is it comprised of several business units or single business units, single line of business? What are the broad reporting relationships? How much centralisation does the organisation have? Is there one finance division for several business units, or does each business unit have their own finance and planning resources and so forth? So it's those sorts of decisions is the corporate level strategy. Then we have the business level strategy, which is the decision as to how that organisation is choosing to compete in its selected markets. So it might choose to compete on the basis of cost, or it might choose to compete on the basis of quality or some other form of differentiation. It might focus on a narrow market, it might focus on a broad market. So that's the business level strategy. If it's a single line of business, it just does one thing, then the corporate strategy and the business strategy are very connected. But if it's a highly diversified business, it can have very different business level strategies fitting under the one corporate strategy. And underneath the business level strategy, we have functional strategy, which is how the decisions the organisation makes about how it actually achieves the competitive advantage it requires for the business level strategy. So if the organisation has made the business level strategy decision that it's going to compete on the basis of cost for maybe a narrow market, then the functional level strategy is very much about, well, how do we achieve that? How do we become a cost leader? How do we focus on becoming a cost leader for that particular segment of the market? So, in short, that's the structure. This is business level strategy, so we'll focus predominantly on business level strategy. We won't touch much on corporate level strategy, just a little tiny bit, and we'll also look a little bit at functional level strategy because there's a direct consequence of our business level strategy decisions for the functional level strategy. So does anyone have any questions at this point before I push on? Nope. Okay, good. All right, so then we move into implementation and we deal with that for 3 weeks, strategy in action. One of the key things about strategy is that it's a very long time frame. so long that you can't really get it right. The best analogy that I've ever found for this is consider an organisation, well, even a small organisation, but particularly a larger organisation like a cruise ship. If a cruise ship wants to change course, it takes several kilometres to do that. They're so big and heavy, they can't just suddenly do a right-hand turn like you might when you're walking or in a sports car, but rather they take a very long time. So if a cruise ship is cruising along and then they suddenly see a big rock a kilometre ahead, they're going to hit that rock. They cannot stop it in time. They can't move out of the way of that rock. If they've got enough forewarning, 3-4 kilometres in advance, then they can turn around and they can go past it. So that's why ships crash into bridges and things like that. They say, oh gosh, there's the bridge, down, we're going to hit it, too late, we can't do anything about it. We're going to go down, we're going to head in that direction. No matter how hard we try to veer away, it's too close for the momentum and inertia and sheer size. So organisations have the same issue. When you make a strategic change, it takes years for that to percolate through. It takes years for you to develop the new skills, the capabilities, the new relationship structures, everything to move through. So we are really always developing strategy for years in advance. The problem is that unlike the cruise ship where they can see the rock 5 kilometres ahead, for organisations, the world has changed by the time they get to that point. So it's like the rock was there, but as you get closer now it's suddenly over there, and you get a bit closer now it's suddenly gone over there. That's what it's like for organisations. The world is constantly changing. So as your strategy is being implemented, as you're starting to approach getting the advantage from making that change, the world's already changed. So if you're lucky, it was a good guess, and that strategy is going to give you a benefit. If you're unlucky, however, the world's changed in a way you didn't expect, and that strategy wasn't such a good idea. But what can you do? You had to make the decision 4 years ago about that, so that's the consequences of that. So strategy is never completely successful. The other problem with strategy implementation is it's usually a big challenge for the organisation. We're going to move into a new market. We're going to compete in a different way. We're going to become innovative and compete on the basis of new products or services. That doesn't always come to fruition. It's a goal, it's a desire, rather than something you can just automatically do on Monday when you turn up at work. So a lot of strategy implementations are simply not successful. The organisation said, we can do this, we're sure our staff are really good. The whole idea that we're going to become an innovative organisation, we're going to open up a new market in Taiwan and have a subsidiary there, and we're going to put our innovative products there. This is really good. We know a lot about this, we've got good staff, we can make this work. But then it's the first time the organisation's ever done something like that. So when it goes to do it, oh, we didn't realise this, we didn't know that. Several key people who we're really relying on have left the organisation. It didn't happen. So the underpinnings of the strategy may not always be achieved in the end, and the world changes. So strategy is a really tough game. So one of the most important things is to keep checking how you're going in relation to that rock in the distance that you're trying to avoid, and make adjustments to the strategy. So it's not just, right, we put that down and in 4 years' time we'll come back to see how it all went. We're constantly evaluating how the organisation is going. Does this still look like it's the right game to be playing? Is this still working? Should we change our minds? Should we adapt them? Should we stick with the plan? These are the constant decisions that go on around strategy. So it's really a constant review process and an adjustment process. So evaluating the strategies is a key component. We'll look at that. Organising for success. How do you maximise the likelihood that your strategy is going to be implemented? We can't do much about changes in the world as we progress towards our strategy, but we can at least do something about our ability to be successful strategy implementers. So that's another session that we'll look at. And finally, we'll consider the role of leadership, because strategy involves change. And we don't have systems for change in an organisation. We've got some systems, HR have a few systems, but by and large, compared to the day-to-day operations, organisations are very weak in their capacity to manage change. They don't invest much resources in it. Why? Because change is not a continuous It might occur quite frequently, but it's not the same as the continuous process. If it's a manufacturing company and they make 10,000 pairs of spectacles per day, the change is not like that process. So they invest most of their control systems in making quality glasses, but not in making quality change. So because of that, most people say, okay, well, what's going on with this change? I'm sitting here at my desk. I'm in charge of a group of 20 people. I hear from my boss, who heard from their boss, who heard from their boss, who read something in the annual strategy report that we're going to have to make some changes. And we're going to be introducing some sort of innovation program, but I don't know anything about that. Should I be part of that, or should I stick with my job? I've got really clear job goals to achieve. I've got performance measures to achieve. I've got a whole range of tasks. They're really clearly defined. I've got lots of systems. I'm really ready for that. And then there's this nebulous change thing that I've heard about third hand. No one's come and told me directly. It's ill-defined. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen. How much should I commit to that? Should I be proactive and try and start it? Should I try and find out more about it? Or should I do what is my job, what I've been told is my job? So that would be a fairly typical reaction to strategic decisions. They're relatively poorly communicated, they're new, they're a surprise, they don't have that same level of completeness and thoroughness and connection with existing systems that the day-to-day operations have. And so there's a lot of doubt around those, and quite reasonably so too. And for those people who've been in the organisation for 20 years, I've seen these things come and go. You don't want to get involved in these ideas that the board have, because it never gets implemented. We're just an organisation and we never change, so don't waste time on that. So there's got all of these resistances to change. So one of the main things that we have to deal with that is leadership. People follow leaders. That's what leaders are, those who are followed. So when everyone's having a doubt as to whether they should be involved in this, is this a good idea or a bad idea to be involved? Leadership is a really important component of legitimising and the change and justifying the involvement. Well, I can see that we're going to do this because the CEO has come around, they've spoken to us all, they've shown us how they're doing it, they're living it themselves, they're doing the same thing, they're applying the same conditions to themselves that we're supposed to apply to our staff. I think this is really here to stay. I'm going to have to be part of this. It's become legitimised. So leadership is a key component of implementing strategic change because of all of the uncertainty that's inevitably going to be involved with that. All right, so that's it. That's the whole unit. You don't need to study any more. We've covered everything, but only at the very most superficial level. So that's what we're going to be dealing with over the next 10 weeks, and in week 11 we will have a revision of these concepts. But maybe you can see from just little examples and the way I presented it, there's a lot to these things. There's a lot to understand about how each of these aspects, like strategic capabilities, like leadership, like understanding the environment, what are all the little tricks that you can use to be better informed about that? So the book is full of examples and clarifications and ideas and concepts that lie under each of these categories to help you have a greater level of mastery of these concepts rather than just a superficial description. Oh yeah, I know the environment's very important. How do you analyse the environment? How do you know when you've got your environmental analysis right? What areas should you be looking in? What should you expect to see out of those areas? What should you do with the huge range of diversity of pieces of information you get from an environmental analysis that really are completely in completely different languages? How do you bring those together? How do you use that to make a change? All of that stuff we'll deal with in discussion form in the session, but it's done in even greater detail in the textbook. So I encourage you to read the textbook for those insights, for that level of detail, so that you can have a degree of authority about these things, and that's what's required for the exam, and of course that's what's required to actually use strategy. So this has just been a bit of a taster. Okay, so that's that. I think what we might do now is move, again, I'll just open for any questions or comments that people have to make. Has anyone been involved in strategic decision making in this group? No? What about club, society, association involvement where you've had to make a few decisions about what you're going to do that year? No? Yes? And what was your experience? Internship, yes. Yep. Oh, right. 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 So this was this is an example of planning for a trivia night in a club. So how was the decision made? How would you categorise? Was it like a mathematical decision, or was it like a political decision? Right. You looked at the budget and you used. Okay. So you used fairly strong economic decision-making criteria, and that's perfectly valid approach. But as I suggested, could it equally have been political? Well, last year we did it here, so if we want to seem to be fair, we better do it over there this year, and next year we can do it in the third location, and we can rotate around so everyone gets coverage. And that's what happens with conferences. If you have a national conference, if you watch its pattern, it just moves around the capital cities in rotation because everyone said, well, you did it in Sydney last year, it's Brisbane's turn because we haven't been in Brisbane for 5 years. So, oh, okay. So there's no, well, let me see, we've got the greatest mass of people who need to go to the conference in Brisbane, or there is something going on in Brisbane which is really relevant. It's just Brisbane's turn. So strategy is often influenced by all sorts of factors. The budget, or political factors, which you might say, well, should that be at the top of my decision-making list? Surely I should be basing it on something more significant, something more critical. You know, obviously budget's important, but it doesn't drive, it shouldn't be the driver of your strategy. It should be more creativity. Did you have a comment to make? No? Oh, okay. Yes, so, but in reality, there are so many of these constraints that often you will find that relatively mundane housekeeping type factors will be the primary drivers of strategy. So let's have a look at some of the slides. Then we should be around 10:30 by the time we finish them. Then we'll have a bit of a break. Then we'll come back, we'll look at a video. We'll have a bit of a discussion around the video. Then we can talk about the assignment, and then that will probably, prepare for next week, and that will probably wrap up what we have to do. Okay, all right. So I may slip and occasionally call this Johnson and Scholes. They take turns in who's the second author. Johnson has the book, although Johnson doesn't contribute so much anymore. Whittington is the second author this year, but Scholes was the second author in the previous edition. So if I slip and call it Johnson and Scholes, that was just an accidental reference to the previous edition. So this is an introduction to strategy. It's a slightly longer play version of just what I ran you through when we looked at the timetable. Oh, before I move on, there was one other thing I meant to mention. Not everyone here heard it, they've come a bit later, but I pointed out that we've got 3 sources of information provided to you for your learning process. One is the book. I hope a few people have come in after I said that, but I'll mention it one more time because I think it's really important. You need to read the book. You need to get a copy of the book, even if it's a second-hand copy, or if it's even if it's edition 6, which is reasonably similar to edition 7. You need to have a look through that. The library has some electronic copies, but it does not have sufficient licenses for everyone enrolled in this unit, so at critical times you won't be able to access a copy through the library. You do need to read each of the prescribed chapters. These sessions and the slides in the sessions will not be sufficient, and as I indicated earlier on, for those people who arrived a bit later, the number one common factor I find amongst people who did badly in the exam was that they never read the textbook. And when I asked them, they came and spoke to me and said, you know, I've done really bad in the exam, what can I do? I got 10%, is there anything that can be done? I would say, so did you look at the textbook? And they said, no, I'd never read the textbook, I just relied on the slides. They're not enough. They are just a discussion focus. The sessions are really more about us having a conversation around it and presuming that you have read it. Because there is no way in 3 hours I can get through the volume that's covered in those chapters of examples and so forth. So you're expected to read it, and then we can have a conversation and I can bring focus to the key things and give you a slightly different perspective and enhance your understanding. In the same way, there's 2 other sources of material which we're going to use. The simple one is that at the end of each of the chapters, and most weeks we deal with a single chapter, some weeks with 2 chapters, there is a case. It's about 1.5 pages. And part of our sessions together will be going through and working our way through those cases live. I won't do a set of slides. We will just deal with it as it's developed. And I will be calling upon you to make contributions to the analysis. So I'll say next week will be environmental analysis. So I'll be asking people to make comments about what are the economic forces on the organisation, what are the technical forces that are mentioned in the case. Now it's only 1.5 pages, so it won't be very hard for you to grasp it, to read through and grasp it and have a few ideas, but I will be calling for contributions and then we will assemble our environmental analysis, so you'll get to see it done live rather than have one that I'd prepared earlier. So we'll be doing that. So that's the second thing. So that's in the chapters, so when you read the chapter, you can also read that case, but be prepared. So what do you need to do? You need to read the chapters in the case before we meet on Friday rather than after, so that you're ready to have the conversations and you're ready to reflect on the differences between what I say in the textbook and the clarity that you get, rather than hear what I have to say and then maybe browse through the textbook in a few months' time as we approach the exam. So it needs to be live. There's a fair volume, it's descriptive. There is certainly some analytical stuff in there, but it's relatively descriptive. And so you need the stories, the scenarios, the concepts need to be familiar to you for this session. So those are 2 sources. The third sources are e-readings, which I've put up. Now, I intentionally, rather than prescribing those to each session as well, because it starts to get a little too much, I've selected e-readings which are integrative, that is that they cover pretty much all or a large chunk of the different perspectives that we deal with. And they're there to give you an idea of how all of these ideas come together in practice. So unlike the book chapters where you've got a lot of words about one thing, there are a relatively small number of words around everything. So they're a contrast to the very focused segments of each of the chapters. And so you've got quite a selection there. It's about 14, I think, 12 or 14 in total. They all are integrative. None of them are totally comprehensive. None of them quite manage to cover all of the topics, but most of them cover most of the topics. So rather than prescribing them, they're there for you to read to get yet another perspective on what we're dealing with and to provide integrative perspective. So read 1 or 2 of these articles per week on the basis of what appeals to you. Look down through a list and say, oh, that one looks really interesting. I think I'll read that one. That's fine. Do that. Because they're just to provide yet another perspective rather than new information. So I won't prescribe them, but I do expect that by the time we approach the end of the trimester that you will have read most of them in an ongoing way. And you'll find that just gives you a slightly more critical perspective. This is master's level study, so critical and inquiring perspectives are what we're looking for, not descriptive perspectives. So the more you read, the more you think, the more critical you can become about it. And you'll say, look, you know what, this idea of strategic leadership, I just think it's a load of rubbish. I just don't see how you can lead strategic change. It's this reason and that reason, and you never get to speak to everybody. How can you possibly, big organisation, how can the board, for example, lead this change? How can you expect managers to take on someone else's strategy and lead it with a personal commitment? I don't agree with that idea, but I do really like the idea of environmental analysis because that really appeals to me. You have to be able to have that opinionated view and be able to argue it and say that, because these are all just concepts. They're not 100% right and they're not 100% wrong. They're somewhere in the middle. So depending on the individual, you can be in favour of them or you can be against them. You can consider them to be effective or not effective. You can have a whole range of views about them. You can consider them a bit old-fashioned. Some of them are from the 1980s, some of them from the 1990s, and some of them are more recent concepts. So you can have all sorts of different views and different perspectives on these, and you need that level of engagement with them rather than just simply reporting on them as this is the way it is, this is the standard. There's something much more to it than that. And as our little example before with from the audience there of the decision as to where to hold the trivia night indicated, the decision-making criteria can vary enormously depending on all sorts of factors. So, 3 sources of information. The textbook, you must access it. The case and the chapter, you must have read them before the session. And the e-readings, you should read through the ones that appeal to you and as many of them as possible over the course of the trimester. Is that pretty clear to everyone? Good. All right, so let's roll up our sleeves and get into this. This is a relatively superficial session, this first one, where we're really just introducing the ideas as a bit of a smorgasbord. And then the following ones, as I said, will be much more focused on a single aspect of strategy. And as I intimated, these ideas come from many decades and really starting back around the 1950s and modern strategy really appearing in about the 1970s. And prior to that we had, and it's still prevalent today, things move very slowly, but prior to that we had predominantly strategic planning, because compared to today's turbulent environment in the 1950s and 60s, once the Second World War, things had settled down from that, things were pretty predictable. Companies mainly serviced a local market, mainly they were local, there wasn't a lot of international competition, technology had sort of come in a big wave and then sort of settled down. Things were, you could predict it and you say, okay, next year this is going to happen and next year that's going to happen, but you know what's going to happen, it's quite incremental. So most of organisations' planning or strategy was focused on planning, the idea, and they called it corporate planning. Okay, so we want to grow 10% per year. How do we grow 10% per year? Well, we have to invest this much in our marketing, then we just grow. Or we just establish some different offices here and there, and then we just grow. So that's predictable. So that's what we're going to do. So to establish a new office costs us $5 million, or maybe a bit more, maybe $20 million. Okay, so we'll do that. That's $20 million in the budget, 3 of those per year, based on our current volume per location. That will give us our 10% growth, and it's going to cost us $60 million per year. So that's it. That's our strategy. All done and dusted. Let's go and have a drink and a cake or something like that, and we're done. So that was the way it was, and it worked reasonably well. But as companies became more and more dependent on shareholders started to become more and more critical and said, well, look, things are getting a bit more dynamic now. International stuff's happening more. Japanese industry is starting to be very competitive with Western industry. This was sort of happened in the 1970s. You make a few mistakes, but generally you're pretty lazy about things, and you've got what is many people may be familiar with is a pretty lazy balance sheet. You're very asset rich, rate of return's a bit on the low side, you don't really take enough risk, you're far too conservative, and generally you're not showing a really good return, hardly any better than the banks. You know, you've got to be working harder than that. So shareholder pressure said, no, you've got to be much more clever and aggressive with your strategy. It's got to be more like a game of chess and more competitive and less just a simple expansion plan. And that's really when modern strategy was born, the idea that, okay, we've got a competitive game here. I want some of their market. I'm going to push them out. I'm going to take their share, some of their share of market because I want more. Why do I want more? Because we need bigger economies of scale, because if we can get bigger economies of scale, our unit prices are going to go down. So we're going to have more sales and a higher profit margin, so that's going to look really good. The shareholder's going to be happier with us, and we'll get another year of running without anyone trying to interfere with our operations. Because I remember 3 years ago when our profit levels dipped, The shareholders were virulent and life was very tough. So we don't want to be in that position again. We want to make sure they're happy, and so we're just going to. This is how we're going to perform. So lots of planning. How are we going to know how we're going to compete? Well, we use scenario planning. We use lots and lots of tools. We're going to have some new divisions of people who collect information that we can analyse to use to guess where technology is going to be in 3 years' time. All this sort of stuff. So we become very aggressive about that, and that's modern strategy. You've all heard the term disruption, of course. Actually, I'm writing an article at the moment on a particular type of disruption. I had a look at the history, and even that goes back to the 1970s. People were talking about disruption in the 1970s, disruption of companies, disruptions of industry, how responses resulted in very different changes. So even the concept of disruption has been around for a while, and the concept of turbulence and change has been around forever. Environmental factors have really been around forever. We were aware of them in the 70s and certainly in the 80s. So all of these factors have been around for quite some time, but what inevitably happens is they move up the pecking list, and you had profitability, market share, profile as key organisational objectives, but now you've got coping with change, being environmentally responsible. It's really starting to move up to the same levels. And so these are creating the disruptions that organisations are experiencing, whereas before it was if someone came in and took a big chunk of your market share, that disrupted your business. Now the disruptions are more outside what you normally think about, technology or artificial intelligence coming and changing the nature of your workforce, or the fact that the government in China says, right, all environmentally unfriendly factories are now being closed down, that's it. You've got 3 weeks. Those sorts of really key mega changes are coming through, and so organisations are needing to respond to those. So all sorts of different drivers, and so modern strategy, as I said, was more about being a competitive player and looking to maximise and manage risk and use a bit of risk versus knowledge to try and get an edge and really collect other people's market share, move into new markets, create new markets, move into Myanmar and get them to buy your cars so that you can now sell more cars globally than you used to. All these sorts of things. But now also being able to respond to disruption in a creative way is another dimension of modern strategy, and how you create an organisation that has the level of flexibility to do that. So these are some of the elements of modern strategy. So we still haven't even got into it yet, so let's get started with the basics. Strategy. One of the interesting things is organisations don't last very long. If an organisation is made 100 years, that's pretty rare. They more on average have lifespans shorter than humans. So they're not around for terribly long, by and large. They generally fail or are absorbed. So what do we attribute this to? Well, the organisation's only lasted 20 years. There's no way that the industry has disappeared or their world has just stopped. It's because of the decisions they have made. Strategy is really ultimately around the ability of the organisation to survive. And we had one theory that was proposed a little while ago now, actually. It's still used, but it didn't really quite work, but it was a good idea, and that was the living systems theory. And they really likened organisations to organisms. And they said an organisation is like a tree or any other organism. It requires inputs, and it requires good opportunities, and if it has those things, then it will flourish. So when we try to direct our organisation, we try to make sure it's got the right inputs and the right opportunities to enable it to flourish. But if you ignore the inputs, or you make a mistake about where the opportunities are, it can't flourish. And as a system, it will start to fail. So strategy is all about creating the opportunity for that organism, which is your organisation, to be successful. So we've seen organisations that have sustained success for different periods. Apple was very successful when they came out, then they had a very quiet patch, and now they've gone back to being very successful again. And each time they have, it's because they have found themselves in a really strong opportunity, and they've had good resources, good inputs available to them at the same time. And they put the two things together and they've done well. But when their opportunities have dried up a bit, as they did maybe a little over a decade ago before they produced the iPhone, or they became less capable, their inputs were a bit weak, then they didn't do so well. BlackBerry was enormously successful. They really claimed the territory for what we consider to be iPhones and smartphones today, but they basically disappeared altogether. Why? Because their opportunities disappeared. Why did their opportunities disappear? Because they rested on their laurels. They didn't continue to be as creative as Apple was, and Apple just took over that environment. HTC is an emerging and strong organisation that's chosen to follow the leaders, and in doing so, it's always had a secondary opportunity. It's not as good as the primary opportunities that the leaders have had to open up markets, but it's been a predictable and solid thing that's worked quite well for them. So they've neither been massively unsuccessful or massively successful, but followed along well. Motorola was an interesting example of a terribly successful organisation for a number of years, which has again faded, not altogether, but their opportunity was all around quality. Their philosophy behind the Motorola phones was that it should have high quality, because prior to that, mobile phones failed all the time. They just stopped working. It was just a really common thing. And you expected mobile phones not to work. Oh yeah, it stopped working. Yeah, that's pretty normal. It's a phone. You know, they're pretty unreliable little piece of equipment. And Motorola said, well, that's no good. So they actually came up with their Six Sigma quality philosophy, which basically meant that 99.999% of their phones did not fail. So people who were in industry said, well, I can only afford to have a Motorola phone because those phones don't fail. Everyone else's phones fail, those don't. So they had a huge market share. But everyone else got their quality up to a similar level or close enough, maybe 98%, that sort of number, so that was okay. And that differentiation disappeared and Motorola didn't have anything else to offer. So their opportunity took a nosedive, but they were right at the top of the game for a period of time. Samsung was, again, it's a bit like HTC, it was a follower for a very long time and followed into the smartphone industry, and now they're still a follower, they still follow Apple really, but they're really pushing as a second, and they're trying through secondary innovations, smaller scale innovations, to out-feature Apple and compete directly for that space. They're also probably slightly more cost-focused than Apple as well, and so they've got some other bases of competition. It's a relatively vulnerable position because they're not the leader, they're second place, but they're investing a lot in keeping that second place, whereas the organisations that are lagging a bit further back and following, but from a safer distance when everything's really known and predictable, are managing to minimise their investment costs or get away with much lower investment costs to hold that position. So Samsung's having to invest a lot more in R&D than the other followers, and so in terms of their balance sheet, there's a lot more invested in keeping that position and therefore a lot higher risk. Nokia's disappeared. Kodak was around forever. Everyone knows what Kodak is, right? Okay, so they were the ones who first moved into digital cameras, but then they just sort of lost the plot and they just didn't keep pushing it hard enough. And then phones started to become cameras, and that was the end of it. Dick Smith Electronics, the same deal again. Over the same market that Dick Smith Electronics serviced was the market that would prefer to buy online. So although they were probably fairly instrumental in creating the market for people who wanted to buy electronics bits and pieces to make things, they also, and supporting that, They didn't follow the idea that these people really would rather buy online anyway, and so their face-to-face outlets suffered. They tried to reinvent themselves, but then they just moved into other highly contested markets, and so they had no future opportunity, so they shut down. Universities. Universities actually hang around for a very long time. Some of the original universities are around 2,000 years old, coming up to 2,000 years old. They are amongst the oldest institutions that we have in the world. There's about sort of 40 or so institutions over 1,000 years old and in the world, including churches or religions, a few governments, and quite a few universities. So, so universities do manage to hang in a lot longer. Why do you think that is? Why do universities manage to survive? Because their intrinsic design puts them, or the design intrinsically puts them into a strong strategic position. One, they employ the people who come up with creative ideas, who come up with innovations. So they've got lots of really good inputs. And number two, the demand for education has only ever grown. It's never shrunk. So it's always a growing market. So opportunity continues to extend, and all the Australian unis, for example, struggle with growth. That's their biggest problem. It's been their biggest problem for the last 30 years, is coping with the rate of growth. And as you say, all the universities just have this constant building program. More buildings, bigger buildings, new ways of dealing with things to cope with volume. So they've had a constant opportunity situation because it's education, and there's just been, and there will continue to be a constant demand because growing demand because the world's population is growing and our level of education is growing continuously and has been forever. So opportunity is great, but also the fundamental design of a university, bringing the most creative people together, putting them in a place, or not all of the most creative, but a good portion of the most creative people in the same place provides you good inputs, good opportunities, and so from that, that living systems analogy, it's a great environment for an organism to grow. So universities have been very successful. Was this a planned strategy, do you think? Was this, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do education because there's lots of demand for that, and we're not just going to do education, but we're going to have like the smartest people in our organisation. Was this planned? No, it was accidental. It was an emergent thing. There was a need, so institutions started to form to bring together groups. For example, Deacon's antecedent, which has been around for about 120 years. The Gordon College in Geelong was the beginnings of Deakin in actual fact. And the Gordon College was brought together because the city of Geelong, sort of 150 years ago, said, look, we just desperately need to provide training for people here. People need to be trained how to do certain farming activities, how to do wool sorting, all sorts of training programs. If we're going to move ahead as a city, then we need to increase our skill base. So Gordon College was formed. And after about 100 years of operation, just under 100 years, they said, well, we're now starting to get into degrees and offering degrees, but we shouldn't be offering them through a technical college, we should be offering them through a university. So that's how Deakin was formed. So these things are very accidental. So sometimes the very best strategies just come out of being in the right place at the right time. If you look by comparison at the independent colleges which just do training and even offer certificates which are also Australian government certified qualifications, they come and go all the time. Why are the universities just arriving and staying, but these colleges in a very similar environment, coming and going, having success and failing? What do you think the difference is? Yep. Yeah, they're focused on the output, which is providing training, and perhaps the minimum resources, but they don't have those inputs that enable them to be innovative and creative and actually really different. So they qualify to provide the service, but they don't have any intrinsic competitive advantage, or if they do, it's a very small and momentary competitive advantage that they can easily lose. Whereas universities tend to have this really big competitive advantage, which they underutilise, but it's always there as a backstop. And that's why they continue. Okay, so this gives you sort of a bit of discussion as to the relative difference. And what we are going to talk about later on is, in this unit, is the idea of the difference between what it takes to be in business and what it takes to be successful. You can qualify to be in business. You can qualify to be an education provider. One person can qualify to be an education provider. You start your own business, Stuart's Education Company, and I get registered and I meet all the criteria and I have a room with some nice seats and a whiteboard and I do some promotions and people come in. So I qualify to be in business on every criteria, but it doesn't mean I'm going to be successful, does it? Because if I'm not the best teacher, or if someone else spends more on their marketing, or I can't meet demand, or people want more than one trainer, or I just don't look professional enough, that's enough. On the other hand, if I'm huge, I've got a really beautiful location, lots of great speakers, really well connected, good, reliable history, some creative, innovative ways of dealing with things, I'm likely to be successful because not only do I qualify to be in business, but I've also got something extra which is valuable, which creates a competitive advantage. So we always have to differentiate in our minds the idea of qualifying to be in business and being successful. Strategy is focused on being successful. Qualifying to be in business is your day-to-day managerial and other functions. You have to do certain things to qualify to be in business. You have to maintain your registrations. You have to produce your 10,000 spectacles per year. You have to meet the government regulations. You have to complete your tax forms. You have to do a whole range of things to simply qualify to be in business. But that doesn't mean you'll stay in business. That simply means that you qualify to then go to the next level of becoming competitive. If you don't qualify to be in business, there's no point in being competitive because you're not going to stay in business. So is anyone aware from history not that long ago, certainly with everyone's lifespans here, of a phenomenon where they focused on strategy but didn't qualify to be in business? Big one. It's called the dot-com boom, where you had all these startup companies. We're innovative. We got these great ideas. This was around 99 to about 2002. And they just employed huge numbers of people, and they said, this dot-com company, what we're going to do is we're going to take, all those empty hotel rooms, and we're going to collect those all, and we're going to put them on an internet portal, and then you can shop around and you can get a really good deal. Does anyone recognise that? That came back again. That was a really good idea. Problem with these organisations was not the idea, but they had nothing behind them. They didn't have business. They just focused on the strategy, and they said, with the internet, you don't need to qualify to be in business. You can just have the innovative idea, and somehow it's going to work. And there was this massive investment. Everyone said, great, okay, bricks and mortar, that's yesterday's game. You don't need to qualify to be in business. Just start doing it on the internet. The internet's everything you need. We now know that's not true, because what happened was the internet, without qualifying to be in business, the internet very quickly drove everyone to a level playing field and created a non-competitive situation where everyone could just simply, because they're all using the same business platform, they're all using the same internet, so there was no difference between the business. We now know that, from hindsight, looking back at that to be competitive, you embed your competitiveness in your organisation. And when we come to the resource-based view, that'll explain how that works in more detail. But the business that qualifies, or the organisation and the activities that qualify you to be in business, is also where you embed your strategy. And then your strategy takes that and makes it attractive so that you can continue to stay in business. So without having something to embed it in, these people in the dot-com boom were unable to sustain any competitiveness. It just disappeared. Everyone just copied it instantly because there was no reason, there was no way they could avoid that. So survival is about, first of all, having a competitive, having a qualification, qualifying to be in business, having the business there, having the structure, having the systems. But the strategy is then how do we augment that and lift it to a level where it becomes attractive and valuable and sustain that so that we continue to run at that level. And so that was a lesson learned from the dot-com boom, that without that personalised organisation, without your own organisation, you can't achieve a sustained competitive advantage. It lasts about 3 weeks and then someone else copies it. And so all these organisations just shut their doors, disappeared overnight. Even as they were establishing themselves, they went out of business. They lasted a month, a week, a year, incredibly short periods of time, because their competitiveness was not attached to anything that they owned. And to this day, in fact, most organisations still do only a small amount of their trade online. There's a few now. Alibaba's a good example, eBay's a good example, where a large portion of what they do is done online. Still not anything like 100%, but a large portion is done online. But for most organisations, a hotel, a bank, a manufacturing company, whatever, most of what they do is still not online, even coming up, whatever it is, 18 years after the dot-com boom. We still haven't really found a way to embed ourselves too strongly in that area. So, surprising how long some of these things take to have a full-blown effect. Okay, so learning outcomes. This is a bit boring. Let's quickly get through this. Just one too many times. Should be able to understand what a strategy statement is and the different forms they take. What are the key issues, the sorts of things we've been talking about. Understand those 4 dimensions that we talked about in the beginning when we looked at the timetable, strategic position, choices and implementation. And point 4 there, being able to distinguish between corporate, business and functional or operation level strategies, as we briefly discussed. So those are the learning outcomes. You should be able to be pretty able to hold up a conversation about each of those. Not just say, oh, a strategy statement is a statement of the organisation's position and mission and strategy, but be able to talk about it for a couple of minutes. Be able to explain it to other people, be able to explain it in an exam, be able to explain it in your assignment. Okay, so Chandler, coming back 1950s, real antecedents of modern strategy. You can see here corporate strategy, corporate planning being a strong feature there. Long-term goals and objectives, course of allocation necessary to carry out those goals. In other words, we want to grow 10% per year. What do we have to invest? It's going to happen because our environment's pretty reliable and pretty predictable. That's it. Let's not get more excited than that. That's good enough. Michael Porter was certainly at the vanguard of everyone know Michael Porter? Yeah, good. Okay, so very much at the vanguard of modern strategy in the late 70s. He started to come up with his ideas, but most of them were published in the 80s. Competitive strategy, the idea that, okay, we're now being challenged by stakeholders, particularly corporate shareholders and investors. Oh, that's another thing I didn't mention. One of the differences was that prior to the sort of 1960s, 70s, there weren't so many institutional investors. Institutional investors are investment companies that buy shares and then move them on really quickly. Prior to that, they were all large corporate investors who just bought shares in allied industries to support them, and individuals. And those people tend to sit on the shares for 20 years. And so they had a very long-term gain perspective. And if the shares were creeping up steadily over that period of time in value and everything was going okay, they generally didn't complain too much. But the institutional investors were saying, no, no, we want quarterly returns because we're going to buy $1 billion of your shares now and we're going to sell those in 3 months. So we want to see a return over a 3-month period. None of this waiting 10 years business, thanks very much. We need you to be much more aggressive. We need constant growth. We need predictable growth. We need growth quarter on quarter. So that was part of the environment that pushed commercial enterprises in particular, and as a consequence, catch-up consequence, NGOs and charities and other types of organisations into much more aggressive stances. And Porter was, as I said, the vanguard of that, saw that arrive and really commented on that in most of his strategies. Some of them were more successful than others, but anyway, certainly from our perspective, his description of competitive strategy is a good one. It's about being different. It used to be about planning, now it's about being different. It means choosing what you do to become attractive enough that people want to be your customer. They want to invest in you. They consider your service to be superior, and that maintains your survival. That provides the opportunity to continue to grow. And leading back from that, we then realised after Porter, well, that's great. You had the opportunity to continue to grow, but how do you ensure that you're able to do that? And that led to the idea of competitive advantage being driven by these key resources, these inputs to the organisation that enable it to keep growing in line with the opportunities. And that was the next iteration in the 90s. But competitive strategy, sustaining a competitive advantage, long-term success is all about being able to be different. Henry Mintzberg sort of came in the middle of this and said, yeah, it's a stream of decisions, but they're not necessarily planned. Some of the decisions are made without you realising them, and he pushed very strongly the barrow of emergent strategy. He said some things you do by accident because you're forced to do them or whatever, and you go along with them, and then suddenly you realise that this is a great thing. One of your key customers said, can you please internationalise? We need you in this country. We're in this country and there's no one else. We need you there. Can you please go there? We'll do everything it takes to get you there. All right, okay. You're a really good customer. We understand we need to do it. We're worried we'll lose your business if we don't. So yeah, we'll do that. Okay, so we're doing it. It's okay. We're surviving. 5 years down the track. You know what? We make a lot of money out of this international expansion. That was a really good decision. Oh, okay, looks like our strategy was to internationalise. We never knew that we did it. This was just a small-scale decision to do what we're asked to do, pushed into doing, and now we've found it's emerged as being a really, really great idea. So let's formalise it. Do we need to internationalise to other locations? Now that we're good at internationalising, we may as well do it elsewhere and see if we can get some more benefit. So Mintzberg's position was a lot of strategy is emergent. You don't know. And coming back to our metaphor of the cruise ship taking forever to change, given that the change is so far ahead, often we're not able to plan for the things that spontaneously occur in our environment. So forget the whole idea of changing the path of the organisation. You just respond to one of these strategies. In this paper I'm writing, we're calling it green shoots. You're just going along and then you put out a shoot out there to pick up a new opportunity. It's not the main organisation, it's just a nimble little shoot that goes out and grabs a bit. There's a bit of sunlight that's appeared over there and the shoot comes out to grab that bit of sunlight. But after a while you realise that that's the place to be, and maybe it becomes 50% of your business. And then the rest of the organisation follows more slowly and substantially, but follows that original green shoot. So this is the idea of emergent emergent strategy, and Mintzberg was very strong in that. It was reasonably well accepted, but no one, particularly the CEO of a large organisation, is very comfortable about admitting that the best ideas are often ones that they don't make. The CEOs, the board, really want to be responsible for the best ideas. And if the truth comes out, or not the truth, if you have to acknowledge the fact that actually all your best ideas were made by someone in purchasing, someone in logistics, a couple of people in R&D, they made all the best decisions ever made in the organisation. What's the point of having the board? You may as well get rid of them. So there's always been this resistance to Mintzberg's position that, yeah, okay, so these things can occur, but should they be the main driving force? You know, what's the point of the board? Are you saying that having experts across the industry with massive familiarity and great contacts, they're worth nothing? So there's always been a bit of resistance, kickback to the emergent strategy model, more to the sort of planned decision-making model, reflecting the role of the CEO and the board and things like that, or the need for them to have an important role in the strategy of the organisation. Nevertheless, we shouldn't forget Mintzberg because the points that he makes are really well made. Okay, and then we're going to look at long-term direction of the organisation. So basically, strategy is a set of actions, whether you decide to make them in advance or whether you make them without realising it and then you look back on it and realise what you've done. Ideas and plans that give you your long-term future, that set you on this long-term path, which is not necessarily a straight path, but it is a path in which it unfolds. And as we discussed at the beginning of this session, you can't do it quickly. You can't make a change overnight in an organisation. It just doesn't happen. It takes years to make the change, so the path has to be years long before the change fully occurs. Organisations are not capable of just instantly servicing a new market or instantly having new capabilities or instantly having a new structure. It doesn't happen. Okay, so strategic decisions, getting down a little more intensely now. They're about long-term direction, as we discussed, because of this inertia characteristic. They're about the scope of the organisation's activities. Scope can be geographical scope. It can be market scope. It can be product scope, technology scope, pretty much anything that's characterised by the operations of the organisation can be considered from the viewpoint of scope. It could even be time scope. Consider pop-up shops. How long does a pop-up shop stay in business? A week? A month? They're a completely different concept. They get a load of stock, they set up some display, they sell the stock. As the stock is running low, they move into sale mode. Everything's on sale, must go, closing down in 3 days. The hangers, the racks, everything must go. They'll sell. They want nothing left. They want zero left. They want just a bit of dust on the floor, nothing left to show they were ever there. Because that way they maximise their profit. So they've got a time scope, haven't they? We're here for 8 weeks. That's it. We do all our trading in 8 weeks. So we don't need HR, we don't need a whole range of other things, because they're all associated with longer-term operating businesses. So scope can be time, scope can be literally anything. So let's just consider an example. We're going to start up a charity, a Deakin charity, and it's going to support people who are low income and they can't afford to buy their textbooks because they're so expensive. So what would be the scope? Any suggestions? What sort of things would we scope for this charity? We formed a committee. It's essentially our board of governance, because that's all there is to the organisation stage. And we're having a conversation around scope. So what would be some suggestions of scope? What things should we scope? Any thoughts? I'll give you an easy example to start with, because I get to go first. Geography. Should it be Melbourne? Should it be Victoria? Should it be national? There's advantages and disadvantages to each, isn't there? What's the reason for considering national? Why might you make this charity national? The reason is that the people that you're trying to support are pretty much the same anywhere in Australia. You're going to find the same sort of people with the same sort of issues anywhere in Australia. Outside Australia, the issues are going to be different because there's going to be other factors, political factors and so forth. But in Australia, it's very uniform. So you could be national, and that way you'd have the maximum impact. What's the drawback with being national? Yep. Demand will be big, yes. Scale will be too big. You've got to scale up very fast. Geography is going to be a nuisance. The costs associated with thousands of kilometres of distance, coordinating over those distances. You can't all just come together and meet for a cup of coffee. If you've got a national enterprise, you're going to have more structure, all sorts of things. So yes, so very complicated. So okay, let's forget the idea of being national. What about state versus, say, regional, like the city or the southeastern suburbs or something like that? What do you think? State versus city. Any opinions? Come on, you're all on the committee. You've chosen to join this committee, so, all right, actually you've been press ganged to join the committee, but it doesn't matter. You're in the committee, so you've got to have an opinion. State versus, doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, that's the whole point. We have to have these conversations starting with something. Nothing worse than, I've been on a number of boards and chaired a few boards, large boards of large organisations. And there's nothing worse than the people who just sit there. Oh, I'm just here for my information. There's no free rides. If you're on the board, even if you're a volunteer, you have to work. You have to be prepared, you have to make comments. You have to stick your neck out, you have to accept the fact that people say, no, you're wrong. When you're doing the group assignment, the same thing. You've got to come forwards with opinions because that's how you then debate those and that's how you work out what you're going to do. You can't just go from nothing to the answer. You've got to have a debate, you've got to argue options. So we've got the table, state versus city. Browser. Well, the cause of our charity was, I suggested, to help people who can't afford, gone to uni but can't afford the textbooks. The textbooks. So it's just a trivial example. Sorry, I missed that one. Just regional. Okay, what's your argument for regional? Very good. Okay, so probably 80% of the impact is just around Melbourne, where all the most of the university is located. There's University of Ballarat, so we do have some regional universities. Deacon's got a regional location, but by and large, the bulk of the students are located around Melbourne. So we can have a big impact without having to worry about distance too much, because it is a long way out to the outer reaches, to Wangaratta and things like that, and there's not going to be many people out there. So let's start with regional. Very good. Okay, that was an easy scope choice. Has anyone got another one to suggest that's a bit more challenging? Anything else you might consider in scope? I'll think of a couple of these ones. Yes?
Who the target students are?
Yes?
Masters or undergrads?
Precisely, absolutely. And you might even think a bit later on, when you work out some of the mechanisms that you're going to use, whether particular types of people, it suits particular types of people. You might find that, you know, there are disadvantaged groups, people who just don't have a lot of money because they're young and they don't have much advantage, people who have moved, all sorts of different things. So you might actually find your mechanisms suit an even narrower scope, and you want to focus on them first because the mechanisms or the organisation that you create, the systems you create, might match particular scopes. So that's very good. Time frame's another one. How long are we going to run this for? You might say we're going to run this for 5 years. There's no reason for it. And this is a really hard one to swallow, so don't worry if you find it hard to accept. But once you've been in the seat for these things long enough, you realise that you've got to talk about time frame for most projects and most organisations. Can sort of be considered as a project. It works a lot better. Doesn't mean that you don't change your mind, but you might say this is a 5-year plan. We're going to do this stuff for 5 years. Works well enough for the Chinese government. They've had, what are we in, 15th 5-year plan now, I think, is currently in place with the Chinese government. So it certainly is a reasonable approach to starting a charity and say, yeah, we're going to run this for 5 years, we're going to make a difference for 5 years, everything's going to be geared towards what we can do in 5 years. That makes life a lot easier. If you say it's going to go on for 20 or 30 years, then you start to get caught up with distractions of how do we continue to survive, how do we compete long term, how do we keep other people out of the market, because even though we're a charity and it's nice to cooperate, they can really confuse the issues. So all those things are about being around for a long time. If you're there for 5 years, okay, so 5 years' time, we know how many books we need to get out to people in 5 years. We say we're going to target getting 5,000 books out every year. 5 years, 25,000 books. Okay, that's starting to tell us all sorts of things about capacity and capability. So that would be really helpful to have too. Doesn't stop us changing our mind, but it's better to have these sorts of plans up front and work within those than have it too nebulous and unclear. And the reason is that A, we need to qualify to be in business. And that's just a management practice, that's not strategy. But secondly, once we've created something that we can legitimately run, we have to work out how we make it competitive. How do we make this make a difference? For a charity, competitiveness is all about making a difference and being valuable. Because there's no point in having a charity that's incredibly consuming of resources like people's time and having a small benefit. Okay? So 100 people responsible for collecting second-hand paper clips around the campus is a very poor usage of resources. Sure, you're saving the paper clips. Sure, it has an environmental impact. But 100 people involved in that, that's way out of proportion with the benefit. So your charity has to be valuable by objective standards. So the more you can sort of plan and set some constraints, the better chance you have of creating something that's not just viable, but is also actually competitive. In other words, creates a competitive advantage of some sort or some form of advantage. So there's no type of organisation that isn't faced with this issue of being valuable. And for a commercial enterprise, it's competitive advantage and profit. For a charity or an NGO, it's long-term survival and the ability to make a valuable contribution. And it's surprising how often we don't think about these things. One of the things that I find quite intriguing is solar panels as a product. Solar panels are good, right? Are they good? Why are they good? A large portion of solar panels on the market over their 10-year predicted lifespan have a greater negative impact on the environment as a result of their production than the energy that they save. And that's because they're produced cheaply by dirty factories that produce large amounts of arsenic that go into the waterways that are very energy inefficient. So you'd imagine, right, a solar panel factory is really pristine, everyone's very socially aware, the roof's covered in solar panels, it generates its own power. No, there's no such thing as a solar panel factory that's solar powered, even. And the bulk of the products on the market, as I said, are environmentally negative over their lifespan. They don't last very long, and what went into them is worse than the environmental impact of just buying the electricity from a reasonably efficient non-renewable resource generating plant. So very intriguing, isn't it? There are a lot of things that go on in our world don't really have the advantage. So why do people make non-environmentally friendly solar panels? Yeah, you can buy them. They're cheap. The non-environmentally friendly solar panels are cheap. You stick them up on your roof, you probably make $1,000 in the end, profit. They don't last very long, so you got the labour and everything to put them in as well as the purchase of them. And you've got, the issue of how much rebate you get for for the electricity you produce, because there's a mismatch between what you produce and what you demand. So when you're here and your solar panels are busy working, you're not using anything much in your house. So you need to sell it back to the grid to get your return. The actual contribution of the solar panel when you're at home at night, for example, is very low. You're only there for a short period in the morning, it's early in the morning, you're not making much solar electricity there, you make most of it when you're not there. So you sell it back to the grid and it ends up being used in factories and things like that. But if they don't give you a good price for your solar electricity, then your return's not so high. But anyway, on average, people make, for cheap solar panels, they have to rid them after 10 years, they're completely disintegrated up on the roof. They might make a couple of $1,000s. That's okay, but you do, and you feel good about yourself because, hey, solar power, right? But the reality is, buying the solar panels, you actually did more harm than good. So, why do people buy them? Because their competitive advantage is it's cheap, and it seems to be valuable. And no one thinks to say what's the energy and pollutants embedded in per panel, please, and compare that to the environmental impact of the coal power stations in Victoria. So, very interesting. Okay, we haven't got very far, and I suspect, yes, it's 10:30. I think we could call a break for 10 minutes. What do you think? And come back. So we'll make it 13 minutes, so it's a nice round time. So come back at 10:45, and we'll start on the dot. Okay, grab a seat because we'll get going. We have just about an hour left, an hour and 5 minutes. So if you'll please sit down, we really should get started. All right. So hopefully some of you thought to take advantage I'm assuming that all this conversation is because everyone's thought to take advantage of the break and start to form some groups, and now you're all really excited about the assignment. So we're just going to do a little quick thing here. Stick up your hand if you haven't formed a group. If you're not in a group, put up your hand. Now keep your hand up high and look around the room and observe those people who've got their hands up in the air. They are prime targets for people to join your group. So after the session, having eyed off a couple of those people, go and speak to them and form a group. Now is absolutely the time to start the group. So again, stick your hand up if you aren't in a group, you're looking for a group so that others know that, yep, we should go and catch up with you, you look all right to work with, or I recognise you, or whatever. And that's a really good way of getting going on your group, okay? Generally, with groups, the sooner you move, the better it is. If you leave it towards the end, you will find that you are working with other people like yourself who's left it to the last minute. Not the best configuration for a team. Good. Okay. Presentation seems to have disappeared. I don't know why. Let's just flick that around. But no, we seem to have lost the presentation, but that's okay. Mouse is terrible. And the point has disappeared. Okay. We're going to get moving a bit quicker because we have spent quite some time getting to this point, but I think it's been a useful, or at least I hope it's been a useful conversation. So let's just quickly go down through the rest of our shopping list here about strategic decisions. We talked about gaining advantage extensively. Addressing changes in the business environment. This is part of that feedback process where we acknowledge the fact that we set the course on the basis of how we thought the environment was going to unfold, but then it unfolds in a different way because technologies arrive that you didn't expect, a new competitors arrive that you didn't expect, there's a new government regulation, there's a new market, another market's closed, the economy's changed a bit, and so the plan you put in place is no longer exactly the right plan, and you need to assess how that's going to affect your strategy. Constantly, and this is how we make our change, we build the resources. So I'm very early on coming back to this idea again and again of these strategic resources. They are what creates our competitive advantage. They are not usually what's used in our operations. They may be physically located in terms of technology or people or knowledge physically located in the operations, but they tend to not be terribly strongly connected to the principal operations. They tend to be capabilities that are built up around those operations, but really are what we use to be different. So innovation is the classic example. Innovation will come from R&D, but it will come from people on the shop floor, it will come from marketing, it will come from everywhere. It's not really, the creative process is not part of those activities. You know, there's a dimension to it, but not the creative activity outcome that creates a competitive advantage. It's not really part of that, but it can be physically located in those areas. But we nevertheless need to build those because, for example, if you compete on the basis of innovation and you are the most innovative organisation, that's a strategic capability which enables you to be competitive. So how we change our path is by building certain capabilities and retiring other capabilities, which is one of the hardest decisions for organisations to make. We've competed for the last 40 years on our staff's commitment to doing things the old-fashioned manual way, and we are the best at this manual production process. But you're in an environment where the automated production process actually produces a better product than the manual process. You're no longer competitive from that. It used to be that handmade was the best way to do it, but not anymore. The automated processes are better. So you've got to let go of that. You've got to let go of that fine tradition of doing a better job through manual production because it's not possible anymore. Time has moved on. So some of these capabilities you have to retire, and it's really hard. When your organisation prides itself in doing the best job and doing everything manually, this is a really nasty turnaround. This is a very difficult pill to swallow. This is very difficult for everyone, from the CEO down to the newest person in the organisation, to come to terms with and to deal with. I remember, quite amusingly, you might find this, the Australia's aircraft, one of Australia's larger aircraft component manufacturers, going there in the 1980s. And they were introducing computers to the shop floor. That's right, we used to make aircraft components without the use of computers. They used to make them manually, until fairly recently. And so what did they do? Their first stage to introducing computer-controlled manufacturing equipment to the shop floor, where they made like the tail of a jumbo jet, or the door or the wheel assembly of large aircraft, as well as smaller aircraft and helicopters and all sorts of stuff. And they were using material like carbon fibre and stuff like that. It's not like they were making them out of wood. They were using advanced materials, but they're still all handmade. They needed to introduce computers. Why? Because it was more accurate, it was more efficient, etc., etc. There was no question about that. First thing they did was put lots of computers out in the shop floor with games on for people to play, because all of their staff were used to getting a drawing and getting rulers out and pencils, obviously in a really accurate way, but nevertheless that process. And so they put computers out and they said, you, whenever you feel like it, you can have a play on the computer, just to get people used to the idea of using computer-controlled equipment rather than doing it manually. And they did that for about 4 years, and then they started to replace the old manual-controlled equipment with computer-controlled equipment. But that was 1980s. Planes made by hand. So a lot of these companies are still really struggle with what we might think is quite obvious it's really quite difficult for them to let go of these things. So this company knew that it would be incredibly hard for people who made parts of aeroplanes to come to terms with the idea that they have to use computer-controlled equipment to make those parts. So there we go. It's quite difficult to let go of the old resources and competencies. And why do you need to? Because you invest a lot of money. When you've got people who hand-make parts of aircraft, you've got to train them how to do that. They can't just get the tape measure out, oh, that's long enough, I'll cut that off, that'll do, that'll be a door for an aeroplane. It's done with exquisite detail. So they have to be trained, and they have to have huge amounts of skill to enable them to do that to the nearest 0.1 of a millimetre and get it right, and know how to assess the quality of what they've done when it's a handmade product. So you've got this huge investment in keeping that capability going. You've got to say, we're not doing that anymore. No more training on how to measure pieces of aluminium for aircraft anymore. We don't do that stuff. We don't even make it out of aluminium, and we make it in this machine, so now you'll be trained on how to use this machine. And yeah, we've got to stop all that other stuff. So you can't afford to keep maintaining capabilities you don't need, and that's a really bitter pill in many cases, because it may be the basis upon which the organisation was founded. It may be one of the fundamental features of the organisation that you no longer do. Okay, values and expectations of the stakeholders. That was a brilliant example of that. The staff, the expectation is I'm a craftsperson, I work here and I make things by hand, and they're brilliant and they're perfect and they're beautiful and they're the best you can do, and now you want me just to press some buttons on a machine and it makes an inferior product because it's not handmade. Okay, it might be technically more accurate, but it doesn't have the same love and attention that I've given it. So my expectations is that this is not a real job anymore, and what are we doing here, and haven't we given away the whole idea of aircraft, that they should be handmade, that they should be beautiful creations, not stamped out of a press. So these are expectations, and these are serious expectations of stakeholders. They're very involved. Shareholders, we're going to invest $1 billion in computer-controlled equipment. We do a perfectly good job. Everyone likes our parts, but they're all handmade. We can save money by producing them in computer-controlled equipment, but we have to spend a lot of money to do that, but we don't have any choice in the matter. So you have to put up with us not making any profit for the next 5 years while we cover the costs of these. And we're going to cross our fingers that it was a good investment and we chose the right equipment. But if everything goes according to plan, it's going to be good in 10 years' time. Stakeholders, shareholders, very difficult to manage their expectations. I don't like that idea. Just keep making them by hand. You're making money. I don't like all of that risk. So, values and expectations. What are we all about? So those are key factors that influence how these decisions are actually made. As a result, huge range of factors involved, very complex. The factors are numerical, political, descriptive, vague, accurate. It's impossible to just put them all together and say the answer is this. You can't. The data is not consistent enough, it's not reliable enough, it's not compatible enough to make an absolute single determination. Instead, you have to say, okay, this leads us to about 7 different equally attractive looking decisions based on the different criteria. This one's more attractive for this criteria and this one's more attractive for that criteria. I don't honestly know which is going to be better at the end of the day. This one's going to give us a good profit, but we probably can't be successful at implementing it. This one's going to give us an ordinary outcome, but we probably definitely can do it. This one's somewhere in the middle. Which one do I choose? I think we can go for the one in the middle. I reckon we can manage the one in the middle, but I don't really know. So very complex decision making based on on emotional and political and risk management responses, as well as quantitative and qualitative analysis. So lots of uncertainty. As soon as we do it, we're changing the deal. Yep. We've made the decision to offshore 50% of our operations. We're going to have to lose 50% of our staff. Let's shut down some of our factories. We have to shut down some of our locations. We have to stop supplying some of our customers. We have to change our supply chain. We have to change our HR system. We have to change our information system. We have to introduce some new technology protocols, etc., etc. Huge changes. Years to make these changes. So lots of operational decisions. But they've all got to be integrated because we're trying to get to a single place. We're trying to get our cruise ship to a specified location to miss that rock ahead that we're trying to avoid. So it's not just making the change. Oh, we're going to make these changes. We're going to get rid of some staff. We're going to change. We're going to shed a few customers. We're going to make a change to our IT systems. Those changes all have to converge on what you're trying to achieve out of that. So just making the change is not enough, but the change has to give you this new opportunity that you're looking for. So they're not just big changes, they also have to be done in a way that they're all focused on achieving that same outcome. So yes, so big deal, and that's why organisations struggle with the whole process, and it's a big challenge. You'll heard of corporate change experts, people who come in. The worst version of these is people called kneecappers who come in and say, I'll improve the profitability of the organisation. They come in, they fire 25% of the staff, then they leave. And over that 2-year period while they're there, profitability goes up because costs have gone down. The organisation's not sustainable, but that's not really a problem because they've already left for them. It's a problem for the organisation, but not for them. So there's lots of simple ways to make changes that have a short-term financial benefit, for example, or even a short-term market benefit. Right, we're going to open up subsidiaries here, here, here and here, and we'll get them running and we'll make more sales for sure, but we won't make any profit, but I'll be gone by the time we have to worry about the fact we didn't make any profit, and it'll be someone else's job to worry about the fact that they weren't financially viable. So yes, so that's the reality, I think, of the change. If it's all integrated, then it's a long-term proposition, and as I said, and in reality, a lot of serious strategic changes will outsee the CEO who introduced them. So if the CEO, this is up there, right, they sort of take responsibility. The board make the decision, but at the end of the day, the CEO has to wear it and say, this is what we're going to do. I'm committed to this. We've discussed it, and we believe what we have to do is internationalise. What we have to do is move to the low-cost segment of the market. What we have to do is increase our online sales to 50%. What we have to do is outsource, etc., etc. And they're fully committed to this. Even if you have an individual who is going to go along for the journey, it's rare the strategy is fully implemented before they leave. They might stay for 5 years and then they move on to another job. That's pretty normal with CEOs. The next CEO comes in, inherits the incompletely implemented strategy of the previous CEO and all its problems and all the bad bits that come at the end. So yes, so having that driving force go right the way through is a real issue as well in terms of just organisational dynamics. So I already talked about the 3 different levels of strategy. Corporate level strategy, let me put it back to you. What was corporate level strategy? Does anyone remember? Yeah, structural organisation, very good. Geographical location, centralisation, what services and things like IT or finances we're going to centralise and what we're going to decentralise. So those are the big issues. That applies particularly in a diversified business with different business units. In a single line of business, then a lot of those decisions aren't required. Business level strategy, what's that about? You're going to have to know this inside out by the end of this unit because that's what the exam's all about. Exactly. The way it chooses to compete. The scope of the market, usually, whether it's going to be different, low cost, these are the basis of competition. And then I'll answer for everyone else. The operations level strategy is building those competitive resources to enable you to actually achieve that, which is different to being in business, qualifying to be in business. Qualifying to be in business means that the processes and activities work okay. But that doesn't mean that you're competitive. Having these key resources that make a difference in a couple of key areas is what gets you the business and causes someone else not to get that business. Okay. So just to look at this again, corporate level strategy, diversification, for example, going into Original Magazine, going into other areas, Business level strategy, making decisions about the scope. So you might do marketing, content improvements to increase the market breadth, or competing on cost or quality. And the operational strategy is the actions that you take within the organisation, how you invest and what you invest in to be able to achieve those things you decided to do as the business level strategy. All right, so this is a diagram that they have in the book and used extensively. It's those three categories that were introduced: the strategic position, the strategic choices, and the strategic action. And you see in the strategic position, we've got four main elements that we think about: the environment, the purpose of the organisation, the effect of the culture, and those strategic capabilities that you have. Then the strategic choices are our business, corporate, and functional level strategies. We've also got the issue of internationalising. We've also got structural things such as acquisitions and mergers, which basically just getting more business, and innovation all fit into the category of strategic choices. And that last blue circle is divided into, the implementation is divided into evaluating how well is the strategy unfolding, how suitable is it, or has the world moved into different directions since we started doing this and it's no longer appropriate? Organising, setting up the systems to build the resources you require, actually doing it, making the changes when you realise that you need to go further or you need to go in a different direction, and focusing on the processes that achieve that. So strategic position. It's a balance between two critical features. One is the context in which the organisation operates, which is its external environment, which is comprised of the industry and then the larger, what we call the macro environment, which is the economy and technology, which is essentially a global factor these days. That's counterbalanced by the organisation's strategic capability. That is, the key resources interact with the environment to create competitiveness or a lack of competitiveness. So if the environment's got massive IT turbulence, but your organisation has a massive capability of adapting to the new IT as it appears and is very flexible, then it's probably going to manage to use that to gain a competitive advantage. If, however, the organisation is technologically dynamic and your organisation has a capability of manual production and lack of use of technology, then that's likely not, the interaction between those is unlikely to create a competitive advantage. So it's the interaction between the capabilities and the environment which is the source of the organisation's inputs and the opportunities that it has to work and thus its ability to be successful and to flourish. So the purpose and the goal of the organisation and the culture of the organisation are factors that influence that. So the purpose is really our statement of how the capabilities we have, or the ones we wish to have, interact with the conditions in the environment to create something. So come back to our original little discussion around our support for students unable to buy textbooks. The purpose is to enable those who've managed to get into university but can't afford all the costs to be successful. Why do we want to do that? Well, because it's a good idea, right? We can be a little bit more thoughtful about that. We can say it's good for the economy, it's good for the workforce, it's good for industry, it reduces the wastage of failed education, it improves the profile of education in Australia. These are all things that we want to do. So we can put all of those in our purpose. And our goals might be to ensure that 1,000 people per year are equipped with the textbooks that they could otherwise not afford to buy. That's our goal. Or to ensure that of that portion of people who fail strategy analysis, business strategy and analysis, because they didn't have a textbook, is reduced from 10% down to 1%, or something along those lines. So we can set some goals and we can set some purpose by thinking about what applying our capabilities to that environmental context means and what's a good thing to come out of that. Because you can compete in all sorts of strange ways. You can either have this strength over here and that strength over there and that strength here. And they're unconnected, but they work in the environment individually to create an advantage, but we don't really know what this is all bringing together. It doesn't really make any sense. Or you can align them all to all contribute to the same organisational purpose. So the organisational purpose, did someone have a question? No? Okay, so organisational purpose is very much about what is trying to set some logic behind all of this. And as we discussed, the culture of the organisation will influence how much the organisation is able to accommodate what you're trying to do, or how compatible it is with the way the culture works. We're very cooperative, we're very interactive, but now we need to be cost focused, it's very competitive, it's very lean, it's not very friendly and rewarding environment, and it's not something we're really very happy to be involved in. Or you want to create a really innovative, you want to have a really innovative, creative organisation that produces a lot of innovations. Well, that's great because we're really friendly and cooperative, so we love to work together in groups and come up with really new off-the-wall ideas, so that works really well. What sort of environment, you've probably all heard about the working environment at Google. Has many of you heard about that? They've got really unique working environment. I've got a mate who works there. You turn up, as many food is free there throughout the day, so you don't go out and buy food, and it's all very healthy food. And so you're sort of forced to eat healthy food because it's free, and who's going to buy a meal when there's a really good meal provided? So it also, you're encouraged to sort of turn up there early and have breakfast there. And you're sort of encouraged to be very social and interactive, and it's very informal, and you can bring your pets there and all those sorts of things. So what sort of environment, what sort of culture are they trying to create? How would you categorise the culture that would result from people eating together a lot, having their pets there, informal work environments? What sort of culture is that? Social, informal, cooperative, friendly, low barriers, not too many sort of like organisational silos going on there. What's that going to lead to? What's that going to support from a strategic perspective? Yeah, so certainly long-term commitment, that's a good point. Did you have someone else? Sorry, I can hear a few voices, it's hard in this room. Productivity, yeah, and creativity. Google is a creative organisation. They're trying to be really innovative, don't they? That's how they compete. More than possibly than productivity, they compete on the basis of volume and newness, and so they're driverless cars and things like that. They're prepared to explore any area. So they need people who are predisposed towards creative activity. And so they're trying to create a culture where creativity is a natural consequence and is very enabled, if you like. And so creativity is a strategic capability of this organisation, and that's why they've put so much effort into developing that culture. And you can be assured that their selection process for staff is people who want to bring their dog to work, who like to be socially interactive, who have a creative bent, so that they're reinforcing that by employing the right sort of people as well for that culture to enable them to develop that capability, which is a key component of their strategy. Okay, so position, we already talked about environment, purpose, culture and capability. So some of the fundamental questions are, and this leads us to SWOT analysis, and you've all done SWOT analysis, and I have to say they're not very valuable. Okay, SWOT analysis is like this snapshot. It doesn't have any sense of where you're going to or where you're coming from, and it's quite superficial. So by all means do it, but do not attribute any great value to it. Okay, when you do it in your assignment, just, yeah, okay, I've done it, there it is, thanks very much. Let's go on to some more intense things. So these sorts of things are, some of these things are the tools that consultants use when they go into an organisation in total disarray. No one knows what they're doing. They're going to go out of business in 5 years if they don't have some intervention. So these are the sort of exercises they do with post-it notes and in an afternoon at a hotel. Right, so these SWOT analysis is a very superficial, quick get in, bit of low-hanging fruit, make a few improvements, And so the consultant's done some good by getting a bit more organisation there, but have they done serious strategic planning and analysis? The answer is no. It's just a superficial thing. So anyway, SWOT analysis, opportunities, strengths and weaknesses certainly is a perspective about how we balance things, but it's also very static and relatively superficial. And we'd much rather see, this capabilities-based view and the more extensive assessment of the environment. But nevertheless, you can throw this in for good measure, but just don't attach too much importance to it. Basic purpose of the organisation. All organisations should say why we're here, okay? Now, our little charity is great. We know exactly why we're there. If anyone says, oh, we need a big IT infrastructure, you can say, no, we don't. Our purpose is to enable those who can't afford textbooks to get textbooks. How is that going to contribute? That's a nice idea, but it doesn't contribute. And those are the constant challenges that organisations face. Oh, what we need is, because it's good, but when you know what the purpose is, absolutely and totally, then you're in a much better position to make a value judgment about whether something is good or whether it's actually going to contribute to the competitive advantage. And because of the competitive nature of even charities, you can't afford to invest in things that are not associated with competitiveness, aren't associated with creating real value. So there are some things that absolutely do. So buying up a whole lot of textbooks at very low cost from a library at $1 each is a great idea. But establishing a complex IT system that might take 6 months to put in place is a terrible idea. And then there's all the ideas that fit in somewhere between the two, which are neither accept or reject, or, well, we should do some promotion, I guess. It's a good idea, but what promotion do we need to do to be successful? Until you can answer that question, you can't decide whether or what type of promotion you actually need to do, if indeed any. So purpose is critical to being able to work out what you need to focus on. We've already talked about the role of culture, so that's just a bit repetitive. So let's move on. Okay, so strategic choices involve the options in terms of the directions and the methods. So what are we going to do and how are we going to get there? The two things are interrelated, aren't they? You're going to have a range of different things that you can do to be successful as a provider, as a charity that supports people providing textbooks. You can give the textbooks away. You can give money away. You can provide them with an opportunity to do a bit of reasonably well-paid part-time work to be able to afford it. You can get donations of textbooks. There are many different approaches that you can take. You can be physically present in every university. You can have a centralised location. So some of these things are directions and some of them are methods. And the two things interact. If you've got a great method, hey, this is going to work really well. All of the publishers always have textbooks left over from the previous edition that they didn't sell. And they will generally give those away for nothing or for free to a charitable cause, particularly if they can use this as part of their corporate social responsibility reporting. So let's work out a way where they can report on their donations of textbooks. Then all we have to do is worry about distribution. So that's the ease of that particular method has influenced our strategy because we've got a great way of doing something that fits into our purpose. Or we could say, look, what we really need to do is enable people to get the textbooks. So enabling people means that they can find ways to buy them or access them, maybe through a library system, shared library system, or some other approach. So what we need is a little network and a combination of activities that's sort of got some flexibility. And for some people it might lead them to sharing, but other people it might lead them to employment. So we'll get a few people involved in this network and that should work. So different ways of meeting that goal will have different methods, and different methods some will seem really appealing, yeah, that's going to work really well, and others won't. And then the method might change. All of the publishers might say, yeah, we did last year give you the books, but we're not doing it now. we're giving them to a different country, so you can't have them this year. That method's gone, and the strategy associated with that disappears. Okay, we've got to rethink. Now, someone had the idea about that cooperative networks where it led people to options for getting textbooks, including earning a bit of money or sharing the textbooks or getting hand-me-down textbooks. Let's look at that idea again. How could we possibly implement that? What would it take? Do we have any networks that we could adapt for this, that we could access, and so forth and so on? And so then you follow that path. So the direction and the method tend to be fairly closely linked, because at the end of the day, no point in having this great idea that you can't implement. It's got to be something that you can actually achieve, or you're not going to create any benefit. Was it Winston Churchill? I'm going to misquote him, but no matter. But along the lines, okay, everyone know who Winston Churchill is? Yeah, okay, so British politician, Second World War, Prime Minister at the time, very notable for a range of things, including his some of his commentary. Anyway, one of his quotes about strategy went along the lines of, no matter how well constructed your strategies are, occasionally you should look at how well they're working. Okay, because everyone was busy coming up with these great plans about how things should occur, and then saying, that's it, we planned it, it's just going to happen. But in the reality is, of course, they don't happen the way you expect it to happen, so you've got to look at that. So, yeah. All right, so moving on. Strategic choices. We've had the different levels of business strategy. We also have international strategy, and we also have acquisition. So some of the things we need to consider, but not so much, our scope is more around the business level strategy, but that first point, the full corporate portfolio may have several business units. So how do you create a set of business units that provide some synergies and some supports to enable you to be more effective? So a very simple example, BHP in Australia used to have a portfolio of companies ranging from mining to retailing steel products. So they had a number of different portfolios under the corporate banner. Some were mining companies, some of them were refineries, some of them were steel rolling mills, some of them were pressing mills, some of them were retail outlets. And they ran them as separate business units because you can't have the same business that's runs a mine and a retail outlet. That's too difficult. So they divided them as separate business units, and they were all along the supply chain, weren't they? They started at the beginning with the hole in the ground. They ended up at the shop with people buying a steel product over the counter. Great. So what was that good? Because then they supplied each other and they had locked in that whole supply, and they didn't have any competition. They could drive the costs down. So that worked really well for them for a while. But then they found that they'd got a bit lazy and their costs had crept up, because when you've got a guaranteed customer who is the next company along in the supply chain, and they're all owned by the same company, so they have to buy from you. If you're not so efficient, well, does it matter? They still got to buy from you anyway. So they found their costs had started to creep up. So then they sold off, and they produced Blue Scope and the rest. They sold off the different business unit sections to different companies to create a more competitive environment, because they realised that they would actually compete better by buying their materials directly from the market than just buying it from other companies in the same corporate group, because there wasn't that pressure to be competitive. So these are the corporate decisions that are made: dividing them up, owning them, selling them, centralising finance. These are the corporate decisions. The business unit strategy we've done several times. Again, it is the decisions for a particular business unit as to how you're going to compete. International strategy. International is about, okay, well, that's fine, but we do steel, so we can't just sit in Australia, or we can't just sit in Melbourne and say, steel in Melbourne, everyone come to Melbourne and buy it. It's not that simple. So do we ship our steel? Okay, we're an exporter. No, let's have an overseas subsidiary. Okay, so we've got a local subsidiary. All right, let's actually mine in some of these other countries. We don't have to bring it from Australia. We know how to do mining and refinery. So let's mine. Okay, so now we've got fully owned subsidiaries and so forth and so on. So different international strategies tending, the steps model, you tend to evolve from from exporting through to having full-blown independent operations in different countries. Ultimately to global and saying, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to do different stages of the process in different countries, and that's what the automotive industry does. So a bit of the car's made here, then that's shipped out somewhere else, and another bit's done there, and another bit's done there, and in the end, it's the product of a global string of factories wherever it's most effective, cost and quality-wise, to produce the product in that stage of the product in that location. So internationalisation is another decision area and strategy. Innovation is a key thing. We discovered innovation in the late 80s and early 90s as a central part of this change process. So innovative organisations will often have more competitive advantage from the innovation, and innovative organisations will also have the capability to change, because innovativeness, creativity has associated with a greater acceptance of change. Okay, now moving on to the strategy in action. It's all about how strategies are formed and how they're implemented. As we talked about, the idea you can come up with a good strategy, great, sounds really good, but then when you go to implement it, you're not so successful. Compared with a pretty boring strategy, but that's really easy to do, and therefore you gain, while you do gain the benefits, you gain fewer benefits, but at least you get them. So we have to decide how we're going to act on our strategic position and our options. So we have the process of evaluating, or setting the process up, doing it, making the change, and having the impact on the operations. So some of the fundamental questions: how do we actually measure the success of our strategies? This is tricky, because normally our day-to-day process has got lots of performance measures. It's all automated, and we've got lots of ways of knowing how, when we make a pair of glasses, how do we measure that that worked? That's all built, that's been well established, and we spent a lot of time and effort on that. But when we just implemented a new strategy, which is to become more cost-focused, we've got no systems for that. We've got no ways of measuring that. We've got a couple of basic ideas. Let's measure our overall cost, but it's not really enough to drive something that's significant. So we have to think from scratch as to how we're going to measure that strategy. What are the indicators that it's unfolding over the years in the way it should, and it's providing the return? How can we pick that? What things should we measure? Because if we make a change to be more cost competitive, we may not see an impact on the bottom line for 2 years. Are we going to wait 2 years before we see a difference? And then we can't really be sure whether it's the result of that strategy or the environment. So we have to have some dedicated measures, and we have to work out what they're going to be to determine whether our strategy is unfolding as it should. So, yeah, and we can also even decide on the strategy making process as well. How do we do that? Do we put it out to everyone in the organisation? Is it just the board making the decision? Is it outsourced to third parties who come and give us some independent, objective advice? All of these things are done. Do we need to make changes to the structure of the organisation to accommodate the strategy that we've chosen to adopt? Who's responsible for implementing the change? It's great to come up with a plan. So I always say that, you know, you can come up with a good strategy in a couple of weeks, get the board to one out off location, speak to a few key people in the organisation in advance, get them to join it, go into a retreat for 2 weeks, and you'll come up with some pretty good plans. But then who implements those? Because always the nature of strategy is it's something new to the organisation. The existing systems don't support strategy. In fact, they support not making a change. They support doing things the way they're always done. So when you want to implement a strategy, not only do you have no mechanisms in place, but generally you're fighting the very systems you put in place. It said, don't make changes. We're measuring the number of specs that we make per year. We make exactly, what I say, 1,000 specs per day. Spectacles per day. Not 1,001, not 900. Now, our strategy has us increasing quality and reducing volume. So that's going directly in opposition with the other performance measure, which is about the number of glasses you make per day. So in many cases, and that's a very crude example, but in many cases, the systems we put in place to control the day-to-day operations will fight the strategy that we're trying to put in place. Yes, so those are some of the questions. So there's a bit of a checklist there: position, choices, and action. Position, what's our external environment like? Where are our opportunities there? Where are areas of concern? What are we trying to achieve? And does our culture fit that? Strategic choices, how are we going to compete at the corporate level? What business units are required to achieve that? International concerns, innovation concerns, and acquisition concerns. And then in the action category, can we achieve those strategies with what we've got to work with? Is our organisation capable of doing those? How can we fine-tune the strategy? What process do we require? What sort of structures do we need? Who's responsible? And what should happen? Okay, so the people concerned with setting strategy, not surprisingly, top managers and also middle managers who report on the real capacity to achieve the changes the organisation requires, and occasionally external experts. We've already talked about this at length, the history of strategy development, but tends to be the different types of strategies can vary depending on the business size. So small business strategies are very autocratic. Usually the business owner determines the whole thing themselves. Medium-sized businesses tend to find that they're very limited in resources compared to a large organisation, but they want to have that broader, more cooperative decision-making process. So they'll have the decision-making process, but then many opportunities won't be possible because they don't have sufficient capability to build the resources they'd like to. Then the larger multinationals need to think very broadly and usually have a lot of capabilities and the potential to create capabilities and other capabilities that need to be dismissed. So that's a very different deal for them. Then we've got public sector, charities, NGOs, all have strategic decision-making processes. So we can have strategy by design, and this is the follow-on from the strategic, from the corporate planning process that we used to have in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And it still exists, the idea that we can design our strategy, which is still about making an assumption about the future and how we're going to get there. But it's quite a rational process. But it does assume a capability of building certain capacities in response to environmental conditions. And as capacities take a while to build, it's really important that we start them at the appropriate time. So if we, for example, see that, China is opening a new version of the Silk Road called the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's currently got about 22 countries engaged. That's a really great opportunity for us here in Australia, in our organisation, to join in this initiative and access all these different countries that otherwise we couldn't as markets. But it's going to take China another 2 years before this is really functional. Great, so we've got 2 years to gear up, to be ready to distribute and to start and to build our relationships in these countries. Because once that trade corridor opens up, we want our products following along it. So we've got 2 years. So that's an example of a design approach. Because you know there's something, you're pretty confident it's going to happen, so you know you're going to gear up to be able to be part of that. But then there's the emergent component where we say, okay, well, you know, we've been doing this, we've been trading in these countries for a while. What seems to work really well is this. Every time we've done this, it's worked really well. So we can do more of that thing, and that's just going to build up our business further. And that's a good decision too, because we've got a bit of experience there. So whenever we send the CEO out there, next year orders are up 10%. So the CEO should go out and meet with the customers there every year. It's a very simple thing, and it seems to have a big impact on the number of orders. Must show our commitment or something like that. Anyway, we don't really care how it works. We know it works, so let's just do that. So that's emergent strategy. It just happened by accident. And that works quite well too. Then the organisation has specific ways of doing things. Maybe we can utilise those. And so those are the informal elements which might just be occurring in the background or may be part of a formal plan. We can formalise all of this, and we need to, Because in a large organisation, we do need to share these ideas. We set our goals. What is our goal? Our goal is to grow by 10% per year. Our goal is to ensure that everyone studying in this unit has access to a textbook. Our goal is to ensure that we support the development of Australian industry to create a stable economy in this country. So mission, visions, and objectives all set those goals. The scope and domain we already talked about, the geographical scope, the market scope and so forth. And then the basis of competitiveness. What is our competitive advantage in those environments? What is it that's going to make us create value? Okay, so in summary, the organisation has a long-term direction, which is the goals, the scope, competitive advantage. And then it has an emergent component. We have 3 levels of strategy: corporate, business and operational, and we focus primarily on business in this unit. The strategy is executed by everyone in the organisation, but we have to create a context that will encourage them to do so. And that's the strategic position of the organisation and the choices that we make and the process that we use to implement that. We can look at it from different perspectives. We can have partly a design process and partly an emergent process, and most strategies are combined out of both. And then we also have different contexts: a small enterprise versus a large enterprise, or a not-for-profit or an international organisation. So let's look at the assessment. We talked about that already briefly. I want to get onto that in a little bit more detail. 2 to 3 people per group. Yes, it does need to be a group. If you try and complete it individually, you will struggle to get a good mark, and I can tell you that from 25 years of marking strategy assignments, that those done by individuals aren't very good as a rule, because they just don't have that level of challenge of different perspectives. And in the exam, which I indicated was a 2-hour exam, worth 60%. But most importantly, no matter how well you've done in your assignment, you still have to pass the exam. Okay, that's a hurdle requirement, it's a compulsory requirement. So you can't pass the unit if you get less than 50% in the exam, and you need to be very cognizant of that. Okay. I'm going to just touch on what we're dealing with next week, and then in the remaining 10 minutes or so, we'll deal with the assignment. So, for next week, at the end of Chapter 2, we have the Alibaba case, page 58 and 59. I'd like you to read that, please. We'll be working through that as a practical example of environmental analysis next week. We'll also have a bit more of a discussion about the assignment as people have formed their groups and started to think about that, so be ready. We'll also briefly talk about some of the practical aspects of how to write the assignment. We might have a bit more discussion about the relevance of the lectures to you, how to set yourself up to pass the unit, and of course the topic will be external environmental analysis. Okay, so now I'm just going to change to the assignment. And let's look a little bit at that. So it's a business strategy report, which means it's a report, okay? So it's not an essay, it's a structured document which has a specific purpose. Right off the cuff, what's that purpose likely to be? Yeah, it's to design a strategy, to make a strategy recommendations. So everything in that report should lead sequentially to that. Now, I've given you heaps of directions, so it's not too hard to make that. But remember, at the end of the day, this is not a conversation, it's not a selection of ideas, it's not repeating stuff in the text, it's not collecting a whole lot of ideas from other people and just throwing them randomly. You're trying to put together a rationale and a justification for a set of strategic recommendations. And we've got 2 major contexts for that. Can you tell me what they are from all the discussion we've had? What are 2 major features of your argument in support of your recommendations? What would you have to introduce? If you're going to come up with recommendations for a strategy, what must you consider as your very fundamental statement? What? Why? Yes. But if you're analysing an organisation, you say, okay, this is what the organisation needs to do. What are the two fundamental things your arguments are going to be based on? Predictions? Yeah, come on, we can use some of the terminology in this unit. The external environment, the context that you're operating in, you've got to consider that. If you haven't considered that, you're wasting your time and you're not going to convince anyone. Right, number one. Number two, the capabilities, the resources and capabilities the organisation has to actually take advantage of that. Those are the two key foundations. If they don't feature in a clearly integrated and well-presented way, then you've got no basis for your recommendations. Now, I will do, and I'm sure we'll get assignments where people come up with some great ideas. What they should do is do this, but they're absolutely out of the blue. They're right at the end. They need a really good IT system because it's going to help them manage their customer information. It's going to be good for big data analysis and all sorts of advantages. And, you know, if they want to network in this industry, which is really important, you know, they've got to have good IT. Fine. But that's not justified. There's no way you can justify making that as a recommendation or spending a cent on it or disrupting the operations for that. That needs to be based on the fundamentals of the strategy. What is going on in the external environment and what does the organisation have or what could it have in its collection of resources and capabilities to work with to create some value in that context. So those are your foundations. So unless the report is leading down in that direction, then you're in trouble. Okay, so we do recommend most strongly. We do recommend most strongly that you do it as a group because you're going to really struggle to do it on an individual basis. The only time I really ever make that approval is for someone whose job it is to set strategy, and they're currently they're engaged in it, and they're simply reporting on what they're already doing at work. But if you're starting from scratch, you need a group to get this done properly in time. Okay, you need to register the group. As I said online, you can't submit unless you do. That's really important. Inevitably, every trimester people say, I can't submit the assignment, I can't find the portal. Have you registered the group? No, not yet. So you've got to do that. Then it becomes possible to submit the assignment. One per group, and it allows you to do that, and you put the group members in as part of the group. Okay. So now you need to select a real existing business that you have some familiarity or some connection with. Absolutely base it on cases in the literature, whatever, but they're not very good. So if you have any access to any business whatsoever where you can speak to anyone in the business, it's much better. All right? Because generally, okay, this is a publishing business. You can find lots of general information about the publishing industry. That's not hard. So the environmental analysis is not too difficult. You'll just have a couple of quick questions about their more intimate details of their external environment. But what you really want to know is about what's going on inside the organisation. And you won't find that in the public domain in cases. They won't say this organisation's key strengths are A, B or C. So I strongly recommend once you've formed your group, you have a conversation, you choose the organisation that you think would be good to deal with and that you've got the most connections with. And I think all of you should manage to find that. If not, you'll have to resort to the external literature. But you know, inevitably, you know, a neighbour or a relative or someone who can tell you something about a business that they've got good experience with or they've worked with or they've owned or whatever. Okay, so that's the way you choose the business. If it's a large organisation, try to scope down. If it's a big business, try to scope down to a single business unit. Don't go down to a division. That's not enough to build a strategy. Although that business unit might say, well, yeah, we've got a strategy. It's not the organisational strategy we're talking about. That's a functional level strategy response to business level strategy. We're dealing here with business level strategy. So if you try and do a whole corporate thing, then you're going to pick up corporate strategy. If you go below the business unit scale, then you're going to end up dealing with functional level strategy. So a single business unit when it's a larger organisation. When it's a small organisation, you can do the whole thing. You can always have a conversation with me if you're not sure, if you think it's a little bit too large or a little too small. Just let me know, I'll ask you a few questions about it, and I'll tell you whether I think you're likely to end up with the right sort of information or you're creating too many constraints for yourself. What you should be trying to do is set yourself up to do a good report or assignment as easily as possible. There's no point in making this more difficult for yourself than necessary. So choose something that's going to be really compatible with the assignment you need to do. So, for example, if you know someone who's finished their MBA recently in an organisation, they're going to be the perfect person to say, can you tell us about your organisation? Because they know exactly what you're doing StratMat. Okay, let me tell you. Okay, the organisation's resources. In fact, I'll just type it up for you and I'll send it to you. You want that level of support. That's really the type of support you need to get. So the focus is on the business unit level strategy rather than corporate. So focus on the business unit. I've already made that statement. Who do you write this for? Write this for the CEO. Okay, that's probably the best way to position this. This is recommendations to the CEO, because who else are you going to make the recommendations sensibly to? So you can assume that they know a fair bit about the organisation, but not everything. So you need to specify it, but you don't need to go into agonising detail. You don't need to tell the CEO, this organisation was established in 1948 with 13 people. It grew significantly over the first 5 years to 74 people. Then it had several bad years. And then a new CEO. You don't need all of that story. They don't care. They know it. They know what they want to know. They don't need to know anything else. You can say stuff like, having started in 1948, this organisation has quite a legacy of advantage, which we really need to consider. So get to the point quite quickly, assume the person knows, but don't shortchange yourself on the ability to connect with key characteristics. Okay? You will find it easier to write a paragraph in the introduction about the organisation, easier for your own purposes more than even mine. I'll work it out pretty quick by reading what's going on, but certainly started in 1948, now employs 5,000 people with a turnover of this in these countries. That's a good reference point for you. That's fine, leave it in, I've got no problem with that, but don't write like pages about its life and history and everything like that, just those key points that might be relevant to what you're dealing with. And as I said, right for the CEO, the first thing he's going to say, yeah, sold. Love that idea. It's brilliant. Your analysis of the environment, really insightful. I hadn't thought about it that way. And yeah, you're right. You know, these are the things we do right. These are real competitive strengths. And these are the things that we just do because we've always done them. And I can see what I need to focus on. And yeah, I think that's going to give us a good return. So yeah, I'm really sold on that. So that's the sort of argument you're putting forwards. Group submission, I really haven't played up looking at it now, the possibility of individual submissions, but let me discourage you enormously from considering individual submissions. You really will struggle to get a good grade trying to do this individually. It's just too hard. Marking is going to be the same, expectation is the same. Naturally, you're going to want to allocate the tasks amongst yourselves. There's a number of different separate pieces of analysis, but then you have to bring them together. So make sure whilst you're allocating the tasks that you allow enough of integrating them back. I think a good group can still make the mistake of investing too much in the individual analysis and too little in bringing it together. It's not that hard to do these analyses, so if you're putting a lot of hours into those and then you run out of time because you're running to the final minute and you give yourself like a day to bring it all together, you've got that all wrong. You're better off completing the analysis quickly and then bringing it together and saying, you know what, that environmental analysis is a bit thin, it just doesn't really make it, so we have to enhance it a bit more and go back and do a bit more. And yeah, now it's really working, it's really supporting everything, rather than saying, okay, it's week 11, we've got 4 days before the assignment's due, we still, you know, world's biggest environmental analysis, it's 10,000 words. What are we going to do with this? And it's not integrated, and it's got recommendations in it, and it's a disaster. So get your analysis done quickly and early and start to assemble your report, and then go back second round and enhance the areas that you need to when you know what you want to say, because there's going to be stuff about the environment which is irrelevant, because the environment's the whole world. You can't incorporate everything. You just incorporate the stuff that supports what you have to say, what your argument you're trying to create. So when you put together your first cut at it and you know what you're trying to say, then that will tell you more about what you need to argue in order to convince for that. Does that make sense to people? So I do recommend the iterative approach as much as you can possibly do. Having said that, most of you won't adopt that because time pressures will make you do it independently, and you'll find you've got 4 documents of 5,000 words each, and somehow you've got to produce a 3,000 word single integrated report out of that in 4 days, and that will be your challenge. Okay, everyone should make a fair contribution. I think that's pretty obvious. Presentation is important. Format, structure, headings all help to hold up the logical argument. When the person knows, the reader knows where they're at, okay, this is the environment. This section's about the environment. Yeah, I'm expecting to read about, okay, good. Summary of the environment, great. Okay, yeah, really got that message. Next section, structure of the organisation. Why we're reading? Oh, okay, I see why we're reading about that, because that's the big issue in relation to the recommendations. Good, good. So make sure you've got good structure, lots of signposting so the reader knows where they're at, and get fairly concentrated in your what you have to say rather than great, pages of explanation. Get to the point relatively quickly, back it up with evidence. But really, for most points that you make, 2 or 3 pieces of evidence is all you require. After that, it just gets boring. When you say the environment is turbulent, it's got this happening, and this happening, and this happening. That's enough. If you keep on going with 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 other things, you just wasted space. You've already sold the reader that it's a turbulent environment. So think about how much evidence is required to make the points you want to make. Title page, title of the report, your group number, ID, table of contents, executive summary. I've given you some word limits to help you manage this process because you're working in a group. Executive summary, 3,000 words. 300 words, introduction, 400 words, then the methods, just what you've done, very brief description, 200 words. Your external analysis, I've suggested around almost 1,000 words for that. The description of the strategic capability, it's easier to be more compact, even though it's equally important, so I reckon 400 words is enough for that. Then the bit about culture, so you can follow these headings, you can use them for your report heading, that's fine. Your statement of the business strategy and your conclusions and your recommendation. So that's it. Don't go over 3,500 words because basically you'll have ended up saying too much and you'll have lost the message in that. I've got some assignment rules there. One person submits the assignment. That's all pretty straightforward. There's a bit more advice on Deacon Sync about submitting it. Any quick questions in the last minute or so? Yes? To make your it's really this last section here is to make a compelling statement about what needs to happen. So most of your evidence, most of your report is committed to the evidence, and then the other thing is what. And so as a result, we can clearly see that this is what you need to do.
Do we define the goals ourselves for that organization? Like what real business we are? How do they know that?
Well, you can't ignore their goals. So you have to have their goals, but you might disagree with some of their goals and you might say that these are out of date or, yeah, they were from 20 years